Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Salter from LiveTiles here. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. We do very much appreciate your time. And I'm joined today by Stephanie Donoghue, who I will let introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Hope you are all having a very good day. I'm Stephanie Donoghue, and we're going to be talking about teams today and successful adoption. So I'm super excited to be here. And David, if you want to go into the next slide, or just we can talk a little bit about ourselves here, and then we'll jump into what we're getting into today.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'll let you tell everybody on the call a little bit about yourself.
All right, well, I'm an owner at Pate Group and a Microsoft Regional Director and MVP, and my focus is really on deployment planning, information architecture, governance, and user adoption as it relates to the Office 365 stack. So I work with customers every day trying to figure out how to implement Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, really how to get the most out of the Office 360 implementation. And we have a lot of these conversations around what is Teams? How are we going to use it? How do we make the most of it in our organization? So we're doing this kind of stuff all the time. And, our whole team, we're super excited about Teams and where everything's going. And we love having these conversations with our customers.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Very briefly about myself. So I lead our technology solutions at LiveTiles. And generally, while I have that focus on the areas listed on the screen, but my job is all just a job about listening and aligning the needs of our partners who perform implementations for us, our customers with capabilities of our platform. And increasingly, as is the topic of today, Microsoft Teams is becoming one of the core areas in which we focus, and very much looking forward to presenting some relevant information about that to you today. So I think it's really important to kick off with some information about why adopt Microsoft Teams as an organization for more effective communication and collaboration amongst your people. But by the numbers alone, it's quite astonishing how rapid the uptake of Teams has been. Microsoft has declared it their fastest ever growing application, and that is certainly backed up in the real world through the conversations that we are having with our client base. When Teams launched in 2017, it in some ways was a tool that provided a replacement for Skype for Business. There were features, of course, around chat, file sharing, conferencing, all the things you'd expect. But one of the things that Microsoft have been very clear about with, I think, customers and with people who work very deeply in the industry, like Stephanie and myself, is that Teams is going to become a platform for many forms of unified content delivery and collaboration. And so that's why that we think as the capabilities of the platform expand, that some planning and insight into what's happening there is necessary. Finally, the feedback. Based on the usage numbers, the feedback is overwhelmingly positive. People are adopting Teams at a rapid rate. They are finding it an effective tool for collaboration. But there is, of course, other elements of feedback that we have received around it. And one of that is that with the ease at which teams can be created, there sometimes is some, and in terms of what goes on when a team is created, there can be some confusion around, what do I keep in email once a team is spun up? What do I keep using Teams for in terms of sharing? When do I use an existing team to communicate with people? When do I create a new team to communicate with people on a specific topic? There can also be some things like duplication of teams, etc., that can create some confusion for users. But I'm going to stop there and hand over to Stephanie, who's going to talk a little bit about more generally how the use of Teams will change how people in an organisation collaborate. Stephanie, do we have you there? Hello, Stephanie. We're just having some trouble there. So, in terms of how teams will change how people collaborate, then one of the most obvious features is that it leads to real-time collaboration. It is much more instant than, say, email from a communication perspective, very self-evident. There is less email, which we would argue is a good thing. And because Teams has been well planned from a mobile perspective, you really can work from anywhere. It can be in the browser, it can be in the desktop app, or it can be from the mobile app that Microsoft have created. So it really has provided a new channel, and in the sense that many people regard Teams as a replacement for Skype for Business, what becomes self-evident about Teams is that it is a lot more than that. There is so much more capability from a UI perspective than that tool provided, and that has obviously changed things for people. So as your organisation begins to roll Teams out, some of the critical questions that we would encourage organisations to ask themselves is: are your employees, who are going to be the end users, aware of exactly what they want to use Teams for? And one of the things that we've uncovered in talking to our clients is that people have a generally good understanding of what they can do in terms of functionality. They know they can chat and they can file share, but there isn't necessarily a good understanding about any form of organizational strategy. What topics will we use it for? Are there any particular areas of collaboration and communication where we won't use Teams? There's some of the feedback items that we are getting. It's also helpful to understand that by default, all users can create a team. And when all users can create a team, we might say that that is very empowering, and that opens the door for anyone to collaborate at any time on any particular topic. But the flip side of that is that you can end up with hundreds or thousands of teams. Some of those teams may not have a particularly well-defined purpose. And in the end, what you may end up with is some form of user confusion about where to collaborate. And in some other ways, you may end up with a sense of clutter around the user interface. So they're just some of the things to be aware of. But one of the things that we're going to talk about shortly is that with a little bit of planning for governance and the concept of applying an organisational specific taxonomy and logical hierarchy to teams, you can very much alleviate some of those issues. So just a little bit of understanding about what actually happens when a team is created. You obviously get the obvious part of the team itself, the chat, the tabs that are there with the various bits of functionality, so for file sharing, for pinning other information, etc. You also get an Office 365 group. You get an Outlook distribution list. A SharePoint site collection is spun up in the background. A plan is created in Planner, and you will also be able to see it show up in Power BI and Stream. So a lot of things are happening, and a lot of tools are then suddenly available at the disposal of people. So the good and the bad of this, there's absolutely no doubt that it becomes a quick and easy way for people to start working together. There is no doubt that Teams has delivered a very broad set of integrations with other Office 365 capabilities. I think anyone who has delved already into Teams and begun spinning them up will see that there's many things that you can connect in from the broader Office 365 suite. And certainly from an ease of consumption perspective, then as I mentioned earlier, very easy to access in multiple forms, be that desktop or mobile. As I touched on earlier, there is some element of users being confused in that when they log into Teams and they've been part of many different teams, they start to see hundreds of them down the left-hand side potentially. Could be more in other organisations, and in the minds of the user, that could be interpreted as clutter. And as we know, when people begin to feel that things are cluttered, they can back away from them, and they can sometimes default back to tools like email, which is not what we want them to do, because we know that used effectively, Teams is incredibly powerful. In terms of being confused on where to work, what we believe is that with a little bit of planning around, defining the areas and topics on which you want people to collaborate in teams, the areas and topics where you don't want them to collaborate, some of those points that we're listing under the bad can very easily be alleviated. Finally, I think a very important and salient point to make from the perspective of communicators in a business. And so by the term communicator, I'm extending that not just to people who are in a formal corporate communications role, but people who might work in a marketing department or a human resources department. The traditional intranet where people are going to consume those formal curated communications is sometimes being looked at less. There are more eyeballs in Microsoft Teams these days partly due to its success and the way that it has been so heavily adopted. So some of the feedback that we have been getting from some of our clients is that as a communicator, they're looking for new ways that they can push formal curated information out to the Teams interface. And that's certainly something that we are going to touch on shortly. I'm now going to pop into a demo, so bear with me while I just load this. So what you're looking at here is an interface from the employee or end user's perspective. And rather than just seeing the default, what we've done is using the principles of creating a taxonomy that is specific to an organisation for the purposes of supporting simplified use and findability. You can see here that a user is presented with a much simpler way to get to their teams rather than a big long list. And as I mentioned, when we talk about organisational taxonomy and hierarchy, the purpose of that is to ensure that things can be accessed very quickly. So if we go away and we define some organisational standards, perhaps it's around topics or teams or areas in which we want people to collaborate and communicate, down the line, when people come in to use Teams, they can begin to filter and find teams. In this case, I might, for example, as a user, just be looking for teams relevant to marketing, or just be looking for teams relevant to sales. The benefit to me then is that as an end user, I'm much less likely to go out and create a duplicate team that already exists. If I can easily find what also exists in the world of sales in my organisation. Or let's say that you determine as an organisation that Teams is going to be used for the purposes of managing collateral related to a marketing campaign. If I'm able to come in as a user and filter on just teams related to marketing, then that very much simplifies the process of discovery of relevant teams. And on the back end, we'll tend to avoid some of the problems that we have around the potential duplication of teams and the subsequent clutter and sprawl that can occur. Just in terms of some other practical ways that we're able to go about that, you'll see here that rather than allow users to create teams using the default form, in this case, as an organisation, we can determine a series of templates that will apply some organisational standards. In this case, for demo purposes, we have projects, departments, and collaboration. But these are all items that are completely configurable to your needs. When the user determines that they are going to be using a team for a project, you can capture a series of metadata properties around it. Again, the metadata that you capture is all completely configurable to the specific needs of your organisation. But once that metadata is captured, as I demonstrated earlier, you can provide your users those simplified routines for discovering teams as they exist. You'll also see here that built into the interface are some smarts around accessing your favourite teams or reviewing any particular teams that you are a member of that are up for review in line with some form of governance process that you have applied. Moving over to this interface now, this is a way that perhaps people in IT who are charged with the task of governing some of these processes can get a bird's eye centralized view on what is happening out there. What teams were created but now have zero activity and may be candidates for archiving? What teams have low activity and therefore are candidates for contacting the owner and ensuring that the owner makes a decision about whether the team is still relevant, etc. All of these things can help mitigate some of the risks around clutter and sprawl that can occur. Finally, and I'm just barely scratching the surface here on what's possible once we set up a taxonomy and some organisational standards, is the ability to begin injecting some of that formal curated intranet information, or the information that you would traditionally associate with a communicator wanting to create in an intranet scenario, for example, SharePoint. Being able to reach people where they are actually working these days, which is increasingly Teams. And what we are effectively recommending is planning for a subset of the formal curated comms that you would traditionally associate with an intranet to be discoverable and presented in various teams as you see fit. Just going back to my presentation now, I'm just wondering, Stephanie, were you able to join the audio?
I am, and I apologize, I missed all the good stuff, but I think I'm here now and you can hear me.
Terrific. Just with the couple of minutes that we have left, is there anything that you wanted to communicate that I haven't covered that you think is a very salient point?
Oh gosh, you're going to put me on the spot here. I think the important thing and kind of bringing all this together, I know it can be kind of scary when you first get into teams. And just because there is scale and there's a lot of things to kind of manage and get to know, I don't think it's something to be afraid of, right? With your user adoption is a good and positive thing. You just want to make sure that you're taking the right steps to make sure that all of this can be managed effectively, and that at the end of the day, we're not locking things down to the point where our users can't get their jobs done. We really want to find a good middle ground with teams on what they can do, what they can create, kind of create that fenced in backyard, and then still be able to control it. And tools like Wisdom, it really helps kind of bring that bigger picture together. And whether or not you're using a third-party tool, there are different ways to approach kind of keeping control of the environment. So lots of good stuff there, and definitely not something to be worried about per se, just something to make sure that you're addressing.
Terrific, thank you. So in terms of some summary recommendations, as mentioned, the overwhelming feedback on Teams has been very positive, and we believe with just a little bit of planning that you really can optimize the user experience that your people will have. And obviously the goal there is to really promote the most effective form of communication and collaboration. So what we've really distilled that down to is 4 points. One is communicating very clearly with your people about what Teams should and shouldn't be used for. So implementing some organisational standards. This is something that can be done through simple governance, or it can be done through some specific tools. Those tools are absolutely not necessary, but they can certainly help in the case of large enterprises. We also are recommending defining a logical taxonomy of teams that is aligned to the structure of your business. It's not there for no reason. It's to support those very real user concerns of usability and findability. So in the same way that people would do some information architecture planning before they rolled out an intranet, in this sense, it is similar with Teams. We are recommending some planning around the structure and taxonomy of Teams to support usability and findability. As mentioned, the purpose of that is not to control or stop people. It's to ensure that when your people log into Teams, that they get the absolute best out of it. And then finally, and this is one of the big trends that we're seeing, is that as more and more eyeballs shift into Teams as a very ubiquitous interface for accessing not just Teams, but lots of other Office 365 services, we really do recommend that you sit down with your communicators. As I mentioned, that could be folks in corporate comms, in human resources, in marketing, and see if you can discover that subset of critical content that you would like to push into Teams as that channel begins to serve more and more eyeballs inside the organisation. On to what's new and coming in 2020. I'll hand back over to Stephanie now.
Alrighty. Well, so we've got a lot of really good things coming here with Teams in the next year. And the biggest announcement here recently, I know you probably all heard at the end of last year, was the private channels. Definitely something that impacts your planning and your security. And so something to really take some time and to go through and make part of your plan. But here in 2020, we've heard some cool things about, there's this constant focus on the first line worker and those folks in the field. And the image at the beginning of the slide deck I was going to reference, you've got folks in the field, construction workers, surveyors, people that don't sit at a desk all day, and Teams is really geared for them as well. And so we're going to see the features continue to be built in to accommodate those people. And the screenshot I have here on the left, that's a walkie-talkie feature that just came out. So if you haven't heard about that, go check it out. That's a private preview right now. It's not rolled out, but that's something that I think we should see here in the coming year. And I don't know, it's something different, interesting, curious to see how that gets used. But again, taking that communication to the next level and really helping out those first line workers in addition to those in the office. The second example I have here in the screenshot is something called live captions, and also in preview. And so the ability to kind of see the text when you're talking with someone, and again, accessibility features. And I don't know that they've mentioned it yet, but I'd love to see that go into multilingual. I think they demoed that, gosh, a couple years ago at Ignite. So I'm hoping that's the direction they're headed here, but pretty cool stuff coming out of Teams. And these are just two examples. There's always a continuous roll of features coming out of Teams. Look for things like additional integrations with third-party tools, additional applications rolling out. So what are the apps that the folks in your organization have access to that they can add in to Teams? Something that you can keep an eye on there too. And then security and compliance. We're seeing a big push around things like DLP and being able to detect social security numbers and credit card numbers as they kind of come into Teams conversations. Definitely expect to see continued push into those areas as well, and further development there so that we can protect our IP in our organization. Now, all of this, we're connected outside of just our organization. If external sharing's turned on, all of that becomes super, super important the more we scale this and the more teams we roll out to our organization. So those are the big things. I'm going to keep moving here because I know we are tight on time, and we did have some questions as well. So Dave, I'm going to roll into the Q&A here. Looks like we didn't get your info on the slide, but we can share that out afterwards. But so I think we had a couple questions on the Wisdom app here. David, I don't know if you saw that. Maybe we'll address those first and then let others kind of jump in and ask additional questions as well. But I think there was a couple questions on the SharePoint site and whether or not the name of the site that's being loaded there in Teams. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the structure of how things are shown in Wisdom in being, being a SharePoint site versus a information in Teams itself. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So from I think if I understood the question correctly, from a naming perspective, we can implement some standards around that. And as the team is provisioned, the related SharePoint site can follow those standards that are put in place. The metadata that is captured and that metadata that is then used to drive some of those things like filtering to find teams, etc., is all controlled in a back end that can be very easily applied to both Teams and to SharePoint. But that's certainly one that we can cover off separately by way of an in-depth demonstration if need be.
All right, and then I think the other question was just the web part there being used for the area. Is that a custom web part or is that a SharePoint thing?
It's
that you were showing in the demo.
It's a feature that we offer. It is a SharePoint framework component that we have built and been able to inject into the Teams interface. But as we mentioned, the tools are only, for managing these things are just one part of it. The other very important part of this is just the governance around people and processes that you put in place. But yes, that is a custom component that we have developed for the purpose of supplementing the default Teams experience.
Okay. All right, well, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. If there's any other questions, we will address those later on. We always post kind of a blog that goes along with this webinar. So I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap up today. Thanks everyone for attending, and thank you, David, for filling in for me while I had some technical difficulties there, but I think some really good content here.
Terrific. Thank you everybody for your time. Much appreciated.